What? Are you kidding? We got us an awesome podcast here.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Rethinking Revelation. I'm your host, Travis Finley. This is episode 68, somewhere around there. You'll figure it out. It'll show up in your feed and you'll just push play, so it doesn't really matter. This is episode 532, and we have a returning guest. His name is Seth Postell. He is the academic dean at the Israel Bible College in Netanya, Israel. And this is going to be a fantastic interview. I hope you enjoy it. I don't really have anything else to say except for listen to my coffee sods where we take some time to slow down and look at the scriptures a little bit more in detail. A reminder that rethinkingrevelation.com is underway. Visit us on Twitter and Facebook, Rethinking Revelation. And as always, you can send a voice memo, rethinkmemo@gmail.com. iTunes, give us some good reviews and good feedback and all of that good stuff. Sit back, enjoy, relax, drink some coffee, and enjoy the interview.
Yeah, in fact, I just had a meeting with God's doing some pretty amazing things here, and I was actually sat with a brand new believer who's getting baptized in another week and a half, and a new Israeli believer, and so he wanted to talk, and just it's exciting to be what God's doing here.
Tell us a little bit about this new believer. That's exciting news.
Last time we talked, I just shared with you a little bit about the fact that there's really a movement here in Israel. There's basically more and more native-born Israelis are coming to faith, and so what's happening is they're also sharing the gospel in a way that's very Israeli. And, the college that I work for, we have a media team that's devoted to videos that appeal to people that are looking and searching. And so long story short, we've just seen a lot of new Israelis coming to faith. And I was just with a guy that had come to faith about a year ago. He'd actually come to faith. He met a believer in the army who started sharing with him, and he received a New Testament and told me that as soon as he opened the New Testament, he knew it was true. And just an interesting story of how God actually brought him to a place where he's now a disciple, and he's going to be baptized in about a week and a half, which is, you may know that.
I just lost you. There's a feed issue.
You there?
Yeah, we had a hiccup, I guess.
Yeah.
But you were just about to say something that was coming up. You said something in a week.
Yeah. No, he's going to be baptized in about a week, and what I said is that for a Jewish person to be baptized is a huge deal because. Basically, that is, as far as rabbinic or Orthodox Judaism is concerned, that's when you've basically turned your back completely on your people. That's sort of that's the last straw that puts you outside of the people. So It's kind of like the Hebrews coming outside the camp.
Yeah.
A lot to be encouraged about here, and that's something maybe your listeners would want to know is that even, I think a lot of people do come here and see the holy sites and things like that. And I think people don't realize there's a whole other, there are things really going on here in the spiritual world that are pretty amazing. Also among Muslims. And so we're in touch with Muslims. I can't even say where, but through our media department, devout Muslims are coming to faith. And we have a guy that does videos in Arabic specifically for the reach Muslims, and very devout Muslims that are coming to faith in very closed areas here in the Middle East.
Wow. Now, what does your wife do?
My wife works here at the college.
Okay.
She works in she's good at numbers, and so she works at the college as well.
And then your children?
So my daughter is 16 years old. She's actually she's in a short-term mission trip as we speak, finishing up a short-term missions trip. I have a son who's 13, who just celebrated his bar mitzvah, and I'm actually going to be taking him to Africa, to Zambia, for a missions trip. Sort of his entrance into manhood is to see the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. And then I have an 8-year-old son.
Is there a public school there? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So my children actually, the public school system in our area, we were not overly thrilled about. And so we're sending our children to a school system. It's called a democratic school. So it's a private school, an Israeli school. And for us, it's worked really well because our children, one of the principles in the democratic school is that they value diversity. And so for my children, as followers of Yeshua, of Jesus, they have a stage as well. They have the opportunity to share. And my daughter, on a number of occasions, has been asked to do presentations on Jesus and what do Jewish believers in Jesus believe. And so it's worked really well. But their education is in Hebrew. My daughter's also learning Arabic and loves it. Huh. And it's interesting too is that they also, part of the school system here, they require the Bible. So already in first grade, second grade, the children start to read. They start to read from the Hebrew Bible. It's not like we have a translation of the Old Testament into simple Hebrew. So the very things that we learned in seminary, right?
Yeah.
When we sit down for family devotions, my 8-year-old, we read from the Hebrew Bible, and there's differences for sure, but so they're learning Bible in the school. They call it Tanakh, yeah.
Okay. So you say, everybody open up your Tanakhs.
That's right. Yeah, that's what they do. And so, again, but unfortunately, the way that they study the Hebrew Bible here, there's not a high value in Jewish education on thinking for yourself in terms of what the Hebrew Bible means. That obviously and so Rashi kind of walks with the students through their whole education process when it comes to the Hebrew Bible. He's the most important Jewish interpreter there is, commentator.
Okay. Now you broke up there. We had a connection issue. I don't know if you could see it on my end, but you were garbled there. So I don't want to try to rehash everything you just said, but I do want you to repeat who Rashi is.
Rashi.
Seriously, can you believe this? I asked him to clarify, and it breaks up again. I'm editing this right now, and I'm going crazy.
He lived during the period of the names. Are we cut off again?
Yeah. Change from right now. It's at white. Can you hear me? Maybe they're watching because both times when you started mentioning Rashi, it broke up. So now, how contemporary is Rashi then?
So Rashi lived during the time of the Crusades.
Okay.
What's significant about Rashi is that it was at a time when the Jews were being forced, obviously the Crusades, but one of the things that the church was doing, sadly, is they would force Jews to come to debates and force them to hear about Jesus. And it was under compulsion, and usually it would be a Jewish person, a Jewish Catholic or whatever, that would debate the Jewish rabbi. And long story short, what Rashi felt like he needed to do was to create a commentary that explained the Hebrew Bible, but in such a way that he gave strong apologetics to disprove the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. And so, he used a method called pshat, And the pshat is a very powerful tool because it actually hones in on details of the text and uses those details in order to basically to present a persuasive interpretation that's non-messianic.
Mm-hmm.
So I can give you an example, right, that actually a lot of Calvin bought into it.
Okay, go ahead.
Genesis 3:15, where you've got the serpent strikes the heel of the seed of the woman, and the seed of the woman strikes the head of the serpent. So, the classic Christian understanding of that is that the Messiah is wounded and Satan is crushed, his head is crushed, and therefore it's a messianic interpretation. Well, Rashi said, no, it's not. It's just simply an etiology. It's just a simple text that's explaining things in nature. And the way that he proved that is he said, or he argued that, was that if a man wants to kill a snake, he hits him in the head. If a snake wants to kill a man, he strikes him in the heel. So the blows are equal. Nobody gets a worse blow. In other words, nobody gets a more deadly blow. They both get a deadly blow, and therefore, argues Rashi, this is just kinds of things that go in nature. Just like a woman suffers pain in childbirth, just like a person is buried, and therefore this passage has no messianic import. There's nothing beyond the fact that it's just people and snakes, because that's how people and snakes relate to one another. So that's Rashi's pshat, and it's actually very powerful. Now I think that there's it can be refuted.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
But the point is that's the kinds of interpretations Rashi used, and they were so powerful that they actually influenced some of the reformers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Calvin being one of them. So Calvin on Genesis 3:15, he said that it wasn't messianic.
Yeah. I've always thought when I think about the etiology argument, I always thought that a better example would have been spiders. I'm deathly afraid of spiders, and so the spider will bite you on the hand, but you will smash it with a book. I thought that would have been a better etiology. It's early, and I worked for 16 hours last night. So okay, let's see. So let me ask you this question. We'll start to segue into biblical interpretation. So. The question for me in regards to the garden scene right now, in your opinion, so let's think back to Rashi, I suppose. The question I would ask is, what is the purpose of the serpent in the story? So it's like if you're reading this for the first time and you come across this talking serpent, you have no previous context in which to run your interpretation, so you just kind of go with it. But you think about it and think, okay, now why is a serpent the chosen vessel of this scene? What would Rashi say, or what, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, is Rashi did call attention to the connection between the animals in Genesis and the list categories of animals in Genesis, and then the kosher laws in Leviticus 11. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting is that there's a tight textual connection between going on your stomach. I don't have the English translation here, but the serpent refers to going on its stomach. It's in Hebrew gahon, right? And in the list of unclean animals in Leviticus 11, verse 42, the serpent then becomes the most detestable of all the unclean animals. And so you would imagine that, I would say that, and I think on that level, I would say that, this whole notion of sin coming into the world, right? What better imagery than to take a unclean animal to sort of make the rest, to contaminate the rest of creation. Now, obviously, at the time of the temptation, that's before Sinai. But I would argue that you're reading the garden story through the lens of Sinai, and therefore it's crucial to understand it in that context. And so it would seem that the interestingly enough, when the woman actually supposedly quotes God, that we're not allowed to eat or touch. Now, people make a big deal of the fact that, she's adding to the commandment. But in fact, the phrase that she uses, don't eat, don't touch, that appears only two other places in the Hebrew Bible, both times in the kosher laws.
Right.
Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, all this to simply say, I think that, that there's such strong Garden of Eden or such strong tabernacle imagery
right
on in the garden that what ends up happening is Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, not just like Israel that's driven out of the promised land, but also, say, as an unclean leper is driven out of the camp. They're defiled from being in the Holy of Holies. They're defiled from being anywhere near the tabernacle.
Yeah. I didn't get to ask this question last time, and so I want to start off with it this time. And the question is, how do you read the Bible differently than Granny Smith, than Joe Christian? And why is that significant?
Yeah, so here's the thing. I'll do my best. There's a side to me that so much wants to defend Granny Smith. And the reason I want to defend Granny Smith is that there's a certain naivete that actually has a lot of truth that they don't know how to defend. And so there is a sense in which Granny Smith is told, or she tells her little Sunday school students, that this is about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. And, obviously Sailhammer used to joke, we need to do exegesis, not extra Jesus, okay? Now, Granny Smith, because she also knows the New Testament, so Granny Smith will kind of superimpose the New Testament back on the Old Testament. So Granny Smith intuitively knows that the Old Testament has to point to Jesus. Well, this little Sunday school student grows up to become a seminary student, and then he ends up in a seminary where a seminary professor then says, listen, Granny Smith was absolutely wrong. You just need the tools of grammatical historical interpretation. And if you use a grammatical historical interpretation, well, of course the historical author, did not mean this whatsoever. It's all naive. And what I feel like, and I did this a lot when I was in one of the seminaries I was in, there was kind of a direction in the Old Testament department to kind of look at these texts as non-messianic. And so I found myself, a lot of the students would come to me. I was in the PhD program, they were in the MDiv, and they would actually sit with me and in a crisis. Like, I've always thought that these texts
right.
are messianic.
Yeah.
Now I hear they're not, and I've gotten such good evidence that they're not. What do? I'm losing my Old Testament.
Right, yeah.
Well, spiritual soul care, and what I would argue is that a literary reading of the Hebrew Bible, and I'm not discounting the historicity whatsoever, so when I say that, what I simply mean is a careful literary reading, looking for the verbal meaning of a text, looking for the ways in which a whole text has meaning. I would argue that when we do that, when we're carefully following a literary strategy, in some ways we can actually help Granny Smith to better articulate and more clearly articulate her faith, and actually have something to say to Dr. Joe Seminary professor who's coming at it with very different lenses and has basically learned a methodology that basically divides the Old and New Testament.
Yeah, it's a delicate and a fine line, and I am by no means disparaging Granny Smith at all. I'm talking. I don't even know how to say it. I suppose I've said it before in my podcasts, and it's going to be repeated. But there's more going on. There has to be an awareness that more is going on. The way that I've talked about it in the past as well is so. Looking at Genesis 1 through 3 at least, I would suggest that if I were to start a Sunday school class, I would say to them, before we read this text, we need to be familiar with Tabernacle. because that's going to help us. You're going to see echoes. You're going to see. And so I thought about this too. For the first time, when I saw or when I learned from listening to some lecture or reading it in a book, that the description of Adam's responsibilities in the garden were to guard and to serve. That blew my mind. Blew my mind. It was like I was looking at a 3D picture, but I wasn't crossing my eyes. So I looked at the 3D picture and I'm like, yeah, that's interesting. It's got contours, it's got contrasts, it's got depth, it's got perception, it's got lines and colors. Somebody teaches me to cross my eyes and I think, wow, I never saw that.
So here's what I would tell Granny Smith, and maybe I talked about this last week, but I agree with you. In other words, without Tabernacle, you miss it. But here's the thing: is that I do see that there has to be kind of a linear reading that also encourages people and teaches them the joy of discovery.
Yeah.
In other words, the way I would, if I were probably teaching Granny Smith to read the Bible, she could teach me a thing or two as well, for sure. But if I were to teach Granny Smith, or let's say the guy that I was just sitting with, the new believer, how to read the Bible, I would say this. I'd say, listen, you like movies, don't you? Yeah. Well, listen, when you watch a movie, you're always going to pay attention to the introduction, and guaranteed if it's a good movie, there's going to be something in the introduction that absolutely doesn't make sense, and you're going to have to watch it through till the end.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something, if you watch it till to the end, you're going to actually start to make sense to the beginning.
Yeah.
You actually have to make it to the end. But somebody who watches a movie intuitively knows that the whole storyline is connected.
Yeah.
So there's nothing random about any part in the movie. And in fact, the things that are most confusing in the movie are most strategic, because those are the things that cause you to seek for answers, the ungrammaticalities, as Michael Rifater talks about them. Those very things that cause disruptions, so you think this makes no sense, have incredible literary value. So I would say to Granny Smith, I'd say, listen, remember when you saw Gone with the Wind when you were 5 years old and you watched the whole thing and you watched it from beginning to end? Here's what I want you to do. Read through the introduction to the Torah. Just read it. And just start asking, not how does this text have meaning in a debate between creation and evolution. Don't ask yourself questions about, what I want you to do is ask yourself, here's a how do you say, my English, here's an assignment. I want you to figure out the snake's role by reading the whole book. You keep asking yourself, how does he make sense? Not just within the first few chapters, but in the book as a whole. Just keep reading. And I would even say to Granny Smith, now Granny Smith, listen to me. You want something really interesting? That half of the Hebrew Bible is a single narrative, from Genesis to 2 Kings. And it's intentionally like that. So Granny Smith, what I'd like you to do is read from Genesis to 2 Kings about 10 times.
Right.
Watch the movie 10 times. But every time, I want you to think about introductions and conclusions. Every time, I want you to ask, how do the smaller details fit into the larger storyline? And I personally think that if we would just encourage people to read the Bible that way, they would have the joy of discovery that I wouldn't have to tell them about the Tabernacle. Right. Now, here's the catch. Here is the catch, okay? Obviously, there are some things that will go unnoticed without the original languages. And to a certain extent, that's why I see our calling is so crucial, Travis. It's not that we're here because we've had the privilege. It's a gift, just like other people have the privilege to study business, and we need business people, and other people have studied. Some of us have had the opportunity to study the biblical languages, and so we're here for Granny Smith to say, Granny Smith, can I just kind of show you that? Interestingly enough, the word for basket in Exodus 2 is actually the same word for ark in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. In other words, not only was Noah saved in the ark, but Moses was saved in the ark. And if you'll just know that, then I want you to think about how these stories are similar. In what way are they connected? And how does that affect not only then the way you understand Moses, but then read that back onto how you understand Noah. And so, one of the things that I regret about my book, Adam is Israel, and I really regret it, is that the name could also be reversed. Israel is Adam.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of, one of my friends actually pointed that out to me. He said, I think you made a mistake. Now, I wasn't the one that chose the name, but in fact, it's only, if you're going to read it, a strategy, it's going to be Israel as Adam, and then only then do you realize Adam is Israel.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, okay. So don't be too hard on yourself. But I thought about that. I thought about that as well. But I didn't think about it in a critical fashion. I just thought about it in an assessing fashion. But here's an idea, right? So when you have a reprint, and you will, because it's such a great book, think of having a secondary image behind it that's reversed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you've got some kind of play there. So you've got that little interesting twist of what that would communicate. So yeah. All right. Let's dive into, as best I can. I just run out of time. I just don't have any time. So hopefully this will be a good interview. By the way, I had a person start to follow me on Twitter, and I said, what made you contact me? And he said, well, I was on Twitter and I was looking for something on Seth Postell, and I saw, because I had posted it, and he said, I listened to your interview, and it was a fantastic interview. So that was encouraging to me, and he was really excited to hear from you. So let's segue into, as best I can, talking about reading Moses, seeing Jesus, how the Torah fulfills its goal in Yeshua. Let's start off with a distinction between Torah and law.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, Torah, and I can't remember if we talked about this last week, but the root of Torah is the same root that we would get the word teacher, the same word that we get instruction. And so Torah is actually instruction. There are many other words for law and laws in the Hebrew Bible. And you can actually look, for instance, in Psalm 119, and there's many different words. Torah is the one word that actually can include law, but it goes beyond that as well. And so, in Proverbs you have, for instance, listen to your mother's Torah, or instruction. Okay? And so, I think that the default mechanism when reading the Torah, and I can only, the world I live in right now, I live in a very Jewish world here in Israel. So, even among believers, their default, you ask them, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear Torah? Law. Right? That's just the default. And I think that when you actually, if that's your default mode, it so unbelievably disrupts the literary strategy of the book, because the genre of the book it's a narrative. It's a historical narrative. That's how it has a linear chronological progression where narratives are interrelated and interconnected, and the laws are part of the storyline. And once people get that, it changes the way you read the book.
Yeah. I would think, since you asked that or posed that question of what do you think of when you hear Torah, I would say rubies.
Rubies.
Honey.
Nice.
Silver.
Gold.
Right?
That's good. I love it.
Right. Okay, so completely, this is just shooting from the hip. I want to see, I have yet to see it. One of my first favorite sermons that I've preached, and I preach it over and over again because I enjoyed it so much, and I got through Dalet, but I started preaching through Psalm 119, and I translated as best I could, right? I translated with the structure that that Psalm 119 is presented, with each line beginning with the same letter. So you have the Aleph stanza, the Bet stanza, and on and on and on, right? I lost him.
All right, I heard each line with the same letter.
Yeah. I lost you. I saw you pause in midair, and I was like, he's not moving. Okay, so the Psalm 119 has 22 stanzas.
Yes.
And each stanza begins with the same Hebrew letter. But that's not the way it's translated in English. And when I discovered that, it was like discovering that Adam was to guard and to serve the garden. I'm like, why didn't I know this before? So when I was preaching through it, I just thought it would be fun to try and translate the stanza with that visual demonstration. But have you seen anywhere that anybody has ever tried to translate that into English so that it's like that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
That would be.
It was fun.
Were you able to do it? Because that sounds pretty challenging.
Yeah, you know what? I'll look for it in my on my computer, and I'll send you the sermon. That way you can hear it. You can hear at least the Olive sermon. But it was fun because it slowed me down. I had to take a lot of time with the text, and so it was enjoyable. I liked doing that. But that was a complete sidetrack. Okay, so what about the difference between? I suppose I think you've made this distinction in reading Moses. The difference even between Torah and law at Sinai, right?
Okay, so the difference. So the question, as I understand your question, is quite similar to the previous one.
Yeah.
So basically, the point that for me was kind of a pretty seismic shift was when I realized, when I studied with Dr. Selhammer, that these laws are always given in the context of a story. That there's actually, you can follow a narrative. And so the point is that Sinai comes within the context of a story. The laws come within the context of a story. And they have meaning.
He fritzed out again. Oh, you cannot even begin to understand how frustrating this is to edit, because there were 5 or 6 glitches along the way. So I'm going to stop the episode now here at minute 33 because I need to walk away from this. So, but it's good stuff, isn't it? It's so good. Don't forget Twitter, Facebook, review on iTunes, please, and we'd love to hear from you. rethinkmemo@gmail.com. Until next time.